Welcome to the Pleasantville Garden Club show. I'm Billie Jean Sorensen. Our guest today is Dr. Neil Hendrickson of Bartlett Tree Experts. He's based over in New Jersey. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
We're glad to see you again. I think you were here with us a few years ago.
Yes, it was.
We're going out of a bad winter. January had high 20 degrees every day, and I'm sure there must be some damage to trees and shrubs and so on. And could you tell us what we should be doing right now?
Well, just what to look for. First of all, is winter injury typically looks like a lot like drought injury does in the summer. Leaves, especially of broad-leafed evergreens, will brown around the edges. We call that tip dieback. The fancier term is marginal necrosis. And what that tells you typically is that it has been cold, and often it's because of rapid oscillations. It gets very warm, then gets very cold. Or the ground is frozen and the air, it gets warm and the leaves want to transpire water, but the soil, the roots can't take up water because the ground is frozen. So what will happen is you'll get this burning at the tips of leaves of a variety of species. And as far as what to do about it, usually not much. Those leaves will typically fall come spring, and the frightening part to many people is the symptoms don't appear. The browning of the leaves won't occur until the buds start to swell and break, and you'll see those broad-leafed evergreens typically will have, or even needle-leafed evergreens, those will show up most in April as the leaves come to life, as it were, and the tissues are dying. And then most of those leaves will fall off.
Okay, I see it on my rhododendrons and also on the arborvitae, but I don't need to worry about taking it off.
Not usually. They'll fall by themselves, and aesthetically, if you choose to prune it off, that's fine. Okay, so what else can you do is a general plant health care program can't hurt, based on a soil sample, knowing what the needs are of the plant, giving it a little balanced fertilizer, but we can talk about that subject because routine fertilization may not benefit the plant, should be done by prescription on an as-needed basis to restore the vitality of the plant.
Okay. Organic is a big word in gardening with trees and shrubs and plants today. Tell us what you think about organic gardening. What is it, and is it important to use organics? Just give us a big summary of that.
Well, the best way to frame this is in New York's new program called Be Green Organic Yards, of which Bartlett is a part. We are one of the companies certified to be Green. And what it states are a couple of things. In the first paragraph of its website, for example, it's about banning certain pesticides as non-organic. But some person who was quite visionary, in my opinion, said we should look at two other components: prevention and also sustainability. And that is a very big word in gardening and in arboriculture and landscape architecture now. And so what it says is if you ban pesticides, but you still have plants that have problems, now what do you do? And it's to put it in one term, cultural IPM, cultural integrated pest management, which means, and I started to talk about this a moment ago, was to have your soil chemistry proper for the tree. In other words, the right tree in the right place. So we can talk about the trees, but the right place is the issue, and the place is the soil. And the soil and the tree in it, or the plant in it, is one little ecosystem. And if we're going to have a healthy plant, much as with medicine in people, if you want to be a healthy person, you eat right, you exercise, you don't smoke, and you're likely to be less under stresses. So it is with plants. If we take care of their soils, balance the chemistry, take a soil nutrient sample, find out just what they need. Are there deficiencies? If there are no deficiencies, maybe we don't need to do anything except perhaps water. Most of what we find out in our soil samples is that most soils on suburban landscapes lack organic matter, the very thing that people turn into their gardens, compost and mulch. It works for landscape trees as well. Our best science, interestingly enough, in the organic area, what we have learned, simulate the conditions under which trees thrive in nature. If you go into the woods, trees are living in their leaf litter, as gardens work the same way, and so do landscapes. So when it comes to organic, the idea is let's get the soil balanced the way nature would like, and very often we don't have to worry as much about the pests that we used to have to treat. Also, some species are gradually being phased out. Trees in the whole Rosaceae family, roses, cherries, crab apples, because so many pleasant traits have been genetically bred into them, like color and shape, that, as someone put it, the bad apples, the ones that are resistant to pests, have been bred out. That usually means if you have crab apples that get foliar diseases, you have to have tree companies, for example, come in, or yourself, and spray them with fungicides.
Will it spread to other trees in your?
No, that's each disease is relatively specific to certain species, but in this case there are resistant varieties. So if you want to be organic, it may not be just banning a chemical. It may be revamping the whole concept of your landscape into low maintenance plants, low water demanding plants, low nutrient demanding plants. And so, especially in a climate change scenario looking into the future, when people talk about, for example, plant natives, what we are all saying when it comes to organics is native to where? People in this area are saying, for example, for now, maybe we should be planting native to Richmond, in 20 years native to Atlanta in the first place, and beyond that, then just what plants are in fact sustainable, what ones will last a long time, and what ones you like to have there.
You mean because it's getting warmer,
and
we'll be a zone or two warmer than we are?
Potentially, that's already being seen. And the other thing is landscape architects, for example, talk about water-wise landscaping. Water is now a resource that's in everybody's consciousness. So the idea of a lush landscape, or the idea of a very rich lawn, heavily maintained chemically and with water, may be going away. We're going to be thinking about meadows. And as far as our landscape, we may not have all the color. One of the easiest ways to have a more organic landscape and not use pesticides is to plant a riot of color to bring butterflies and birds. 85, those nice plants will have pests on them, but 85% of a bird's diet, for example, is protein, insects. Let the birds do our insect control for us.
Yes, I'm already pretty much giving up on lawns because I don't use any chemicals on them. And so I do get weeds, but so I get weeds. And I will hope not to have any lawn eventually, but to have, maybe some underplanting of wildflowers or something.
And that is the goal of the whole green movement, and that is what's behind this Be Green as well, is that's sustainable, a self-replicating meadow of flowering plants, for example.
So you're saying even with a tree in the spring, the best food for it would be a compost?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that? Exactly. I see what you're about to say. Is how deep? Yeah. Do it the way nature would do it. The worst problem we still see, there are two main problems, and this comes into this whole issue as well, is deep planting and overmulching. Those two combined are a death sentence, and what happens is because those plants tend to be weaker, they tend to have more problems. We tend to intervene above ground, but these are soil-related problems. So when someone chooses a plant, goes to a nursery, brings a plant home, it's very simple. It's a problem we've been discussing for 20 years or longer. If a plant goes into the ground, a tree or a shrub, like a telephone pole, it's totally unacceptable and leads to a shorter lifespan of the plant. If we were in kindergarten and drawing a tree, we would draw it with a flare. That is the way nature grows a tree. The seed falls on the ground, the top grows up, and the roots grow down. If that flare is not visible on the surface, it is totally unacceptable, and it will probably mean a shorter life of the plant and more intervention by arborists like us. The other thing is, even if there's a flare, the last thing we want to do is pile mulch up against it. The closest analogy in humans is that if someone falls asleep in the bathtub and fingers come out like a corpse, well, the bark of a tree is no more waterproof than fingers are. They breathe through the skin, and trees breathe through the bark. If you hold mulch against it, a variety of things can go wrong. Water will penetrate. When it does, it'll be held against the bark. The bark will gradually decay. Fine roots will break out of the bark, and the main root system will rot away. The trees can fall over. Their growth rate's usually suboptimal, and it goes on. The same is true with planting trees with landscape fabric. We don't think much of it. The research at our own laboratory shows that weeds will eventually work their way around it, and it prevents the breakdown of mulch becoming incorporated into the soil as humus and compost. So if someone has the simplest question about what should I do, you've already addressed it, which is grow the plant the way nature would have grown.
Well, first you must plant, the hole should be wider than it is deep, right?
For sure. The idea is also, and you raise another issue of what's a big deal in the industry. At almost every time in every plant's life, unless it's bare rooted, and that hasn't caught on with most homeowners, it's caught on with municipalities and bigger government agencies, is to plant a tree that comes bare root, no soil. But the two other choices, which are container plants and balled and burlap plants, the container comes in obviously a black plastic container, but when the roots of a plant, if they are left in that container 1 minute more than they need to be, the roots will reach the edge and start to circle. Those roots never reorient themselves into a more desirable wagon wheel design. So for many years, people would say, in our industry, would say, tip the plant over, take the container off, and simply score the roots to allow them to come out. Well, more and more research has accumulated to indicate that the roots, in fact, never do that on their own. That we now call it root ball shaving, that what you need to do for that root before you worry about the size of the hole in which to plant is to, if that has a steering wheel essentially around it of circling roots, take them off. And does that sound like a frightening prospect? Yes. But we have shown at research at our laboratory, as have others at universities, have shown that in fact the growth may be depressed for a year or so, but then those trees that are properly have their root shape will outperform, grow faster, and live longer than the ones that are planted greener but actually more defectively. So that is one thing, and in fact with balled and burlap trees you don't avoid that either, because before the plant went into the ball, typically it was a container plant at some time. So in the case of a ball and burlap plant, it's the best way to get a very big plant, but you also typically don't see the root flare, you don't know what you're getting for roots, and even in our situation with big balled and burlap plants, we almost bare root them because the root system is so critical. And last point on that, I'll leave you with one point on this, that research from the University of Florida pointed out that excess mulch is so deleterious, so bad for newly planted trees, that it is better not to mulch at all than to overmulch.
Okay.
But we want mulch on the soil because as it incorporates, as I said, most soils are deficient in organic matter, and once the organic matter builds up in the soil, the nutrient capital will also improve.
But not near the trunk, a few inches away from the trunk. And would you recommend, when you buy a new tree or shrub, checking on the internet for that plant and following instructions you would get there about care of it? Because 2 years from now, you could forget what to do with the plant. Is it advisable to go on the internet and look and read about it?
Well, that's going to vary. Many, I've looked at a few, and many nurseries are still adhering to relatively old concepts about how deep to plant and what else to do. Some of these ideas are relatively radical, like shaving the roots off.
So you have to be very careful what website you would go to.
Universities, in the case of New York, Cornell has an excellent website on Cornell horticulture about how to plant a tree properly, how to get the root flare grade, how to get your roots oriented. Yes, that's the place to go.
So Cornell and some of the other universities
almost
would
all
be
of
the best
universities,
places to go.
Because they do research and they're relatively current.
Okay, let's move on a little bit. One of the things I want to talk about is tree risk evaluation. Even in my own garden, I have a tree, a tall evergreen tree that's planted fairly close to the edge of the property on kind of a hill slope. And how do we evaluate whether a tree is safe or to leave as it is?
Well, this is one of the most controversial areas of arboriculture. And the reason for that is, much like with a physician, although a disorder may be common through a lot of people, every patient is unique. And as a person, you always hope your physician will treat you as a patient rather than just the problem that you may have, because it's unique in your condition. With a tree, it's the same thing. Trees can be hollow, remarkably enough, and perfectly sound. Because if it's a healthy tree, whatever caused the decay, there may be a perfectly sound tree on the outside. This is what has been recently come up in a field called biomechanics, and it's how trees operate with loads like wind on them. For example, look at any major engineering structure, George Washington Bridge, they're hollow. There's mostly hollow spaces. So if you have a narrow pole, like a tree would be when it's young, or an old tree which is a very wide base but hollow, that's a pretty sound engineering structure. So the trick will be of any arborist, is the trick for any person who suspects to have their tree have a problem, is to talk to an arborist, in fact maybe several, because they'll all get different opinions and it'll be very confusing. The International Society of Arboriculture, for example, is creating a certification that not an ordinary arborist, like most of us, will be qualified to look at trees. They will have to have 2 days of intensive training and pass tests to identify whether in fact a tree with defects is hazardous. And there's a very important difference there. You can have a tree that has full of defects. It can have cavities, it can have broken limbs, but if it doesn't have something it can fall on and do damage to, it's not hazardous. So the term hazard tree has its own inferences. So we can certainly look at trees, and I've looked at many that I can say it's a very defective tree, but I don't think it's hazardous. But it does take a lot of judgment, and so we can measure almost a million different things on trees. We have tools, we have radar, we have ultrasound. That tells us one small part of it. What you really have to rely on is the judgment of a very experienced and dedicated arborist, because, and even then, there may not be one right answer. And any sane arborist will pass that on and say, this is the information I have for you, but it's your decision. We don't want to take the responsibility. I don't certainly want to say this tree is going to be fine, and you're very nervous about it. And this is what we call risk tolerance or client attitude. If someone is very nervous about a tree every time it blows on a windy night and we find any defects on it, we're likely to remove it. On the other hand, someone said, my father planted this tree in the front yard and I want to have it live. Then we will make every effort to find a good reason to keep it. So tree risk analysis, as it's called, or tree hazard evaluation, we do, it varies a lot by tree and by client. The two interact. There's an historic site at which we work where a President, Theodore Roosevelt, on Long Island planted, or his family planted the tree, and as they told me about this tree at Sagamore Hill on Long Island, it's hardscape to them, meaning it's part of the house, it's part of their landscape. And when none of us want to see it pass on our watch. The tree is well over 100 years old.
What tree is it?
It's a copper beech. It's next to their house, and it shaded his presidential summer White House. Where he held conferences and resolved the Japanese-Russian War of 1905 and all those great stories that go with it. But the tree has to be essentially permanent. So in cases like this, risk assessment depends a lot on how they look at it. We want that tree to be there at almost any cost. So,
but there are people walking near it all the time, or
by
no?
the thousands.
So.
And there are other simple examples. We have it's a client of the company's, but I had a chance to go to Mount Vernon and Monticello, and there are massive trees over houses that could not be any more historic. Everyone I know in our company that has looked at this tree, and the only reason it stands is because, number one, the tree is important, and we have said there's no such thing as a tree that doesn't represent some risk. Trees fail when winds get to be 40 to 70 miles an hour. There's no safe tree. In Central Park a couple of years ago, I happened to be there right after the big storm in August, and what I saw was decayed trees that failed and perfectly sound trees right next to them which also failed. So sometimes it's more about the storm than it is the tree, as you found out here not long ago along, for example, the Sawmill.
Oh yes, when the tornado came through there, yeah. We talked a little bit before the program about invasive species. Maybe we should touch on that, and you should suggest which species should be avoided, or which trees should be avoided, or whether they're...
Well, along those lines, this kind of brings us back around to the whole organic part, and this is definitely part of the cultural part of getting to an organic, sustainable landscape. In fact, there is a very big program that people will shortly hear about if they haven't already, called the Sustainable Sites Initiative. It was initiated by the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and the National Botanical Garden. And what it said is it created a framework, it's voluntary, for making sites sustainable, for landscapes sustainable. There are so many buildings that people have heard about that are LEED certified, and that means that they are carbon neutral, basically. But landscapes were largely ignored. And now this SITES, as it's called, as an acronym, Sustainable Sites Initiative, has given these guidelines for keeping landscapes sustainable. And the first step of plant management is remove invasive vegetation, because you can't establish natives, you can't protect the soil, you can't follow all the protocols of giving you a sustainable landscape. Certainly invasives are sustainable. They will take over and eliminate everything else. So this has become an enormous part of the business of arboriculture, and it's become a big part of the business of landscape architecture. What do we do? And for anyone who's got a garden and who has experienced garlic mustard or purple loosestrife or Japanese stiltgrass, the list goes on and on. And here is the difficult part, that there is no good way to get rid of them, short of pulling them, if you go to a totally organic program. For example, in Ontario, where I was recently, or British Columbia, they've had a total ban, and their only herbicides are lemon juice, or derivatives of lemon juice. The acid works on them. Does it work? Barely. And on a small piece of property, perhaps. The only thing to do is pull all these weeds manually. It's really a finger in the dike sort of problem, and it's hard to resist the spread of the invasives if you're pulling them manually. So therefore, then you have to fall back on herbicides. Now, properly used, we for example, use a very low volume treatment where we only need to put a few drops on the leaves.
And what is that?
It's, well, there's typical, the one that everyone knows is glyphosate. The Million Trees program in New York, I think it's the Million Trees, but there's a New York initiative in which we're involved where they specify it to restore, to do restoration ecology, which is a huge part of where ecology is going, to restore these landscapes. Means that you're going to have to use chemicals. In this case, typically glyphosate, commonly known as Roundup.
Yes, that's fairly safe then. Mm-hmm.
Well, sure, in the right hands. I've certainly seen trees killed by the misuse of it. It's like anything else. It's like your own medication. If any of us take medications and you decide that if half a pill is good that the doctor told you was enough, and you take 10, you can certainly do yourself some harm. So it is with Roundup. But the point of it is vegetation management or invasive species management. When it comes to plants, there is no way around it. This is going to be something where the cure is going to be, you may worry about the cure, but untreated, the disease of invasive plants will take over and gradually eliminate the native landscape that as we know it. Because of the tens of thousands of plants that have been introduced since the 1700s here, there's only a few hundred that are really, really awful. Kudzu in the south.
Oh, yeah. Kudzu here now.
It's working its way. Yeah. And so with these, if we don't manage them, they will manage us. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, as in the case of medicine, you have to take something you wish you wouldn't because it'll half kill you, but to cure you. It's the same idea. Properly used herbicides can be very safe, but in the right hands.
Is that kudzu? Is that what it is along the Sawmill Parkway?
I haven't even looked.
Well, it's a plant that's covering all the trees.
It could be grape, could be porcelain berry.
Bittersweets.
Bittersweets, one of them. Japanese knotweed is another one that.
Will those eventually kill the trees? And
if the leaves of any vine-like invasive will get into the crown of a tree, they use the tree for support, and then typically what you'll see is that terribly overlapping canopy of very green leaves. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what they do is there's only so much sunlight, and if they intercept all of it, there won't be anything left for the tree, and yes, they can kill it. Mm-hmm. Rarely will things kill the tree by strangling. Wisteria can do it when it gets out and into the woods. Not many other will strangle the tree. Bittersweet can constrict it, but there are not many vines that strangle trees. Mostly
some suns will still get in with bittersweet. Believe it or not, our time is almost gone, so I just want to ask you if there's any other subject you'd like to cover briefly? We have a couple of minutes.
Well, really, what's really interesting about our industry, about the industry of trees and landscapes, is whether the entire organic movement is moving forward. The idea, however we look at it, there's people who are pro-pesticides, anti-pesticides. It's not about that. It's about the future and this word sustainability. There's another word I like too called regenerative landscapes. It means that instead of just having plain green landscapes, they may not be very sustainable because they require inputs of pesticides and fertilizers. The idea of regenerative means that the landscape that you have in your yard can provide you with benefits, better air, better use of water, retention of water. The landscape architects talk about bioswales and bioretention. Green roof is out there. So the idea is to have not only your landscape look nice, but provide you with more benefits and less inputs.
How is the best way for the average gardener to learn more about sustainable?
Well, if someone is interested, the Sustainable Sites Initiative was designed for big properties, campuses, big buildings. There is something that derived from the Sustainable Sites Initiative called Landscape for Life, and it's designed for the home gardener. I recommend you just Google.
Is it a book or?
It's a website.
A website, Landscape for Life.
Shortened to LFL. If you put into a search engine, Landscape for Life, an enormous amount of information will pour forth, a lot of which I've talked about.
That's probably the most important thing we've said today, because that will really help the average gardener to find out what to do.
It certainly helped me.
Her garden. Well, it's been lovely to see you again, and thank you so much. You always are filled with great information, and we appreciate your coming. Thank you so much, and thank you for watching.